Hello, I'm Tom Martin, and welcome to another episode of A San Francisco Conservative. This is the podcast series featuring yours truly, Tom Martin. I'm a lifelong journalist. I've had the pleasure of producing interviews for Diane Sawyer at ABC Good Morning America, for Charles Kuralt at CBS News Sunday Morning, for the team over at CNN, and I've even covered the White House for Public Television's Nightly Business Report. I love meeting interesting people and having thought-provoking conversations, and that's exactly what we do here on A San Francisco Conservative. We've titled this podcast series after author David Parker's second book. David is the author of three excellent books, which I highly recommend: Income and Wealth, A San Francisco Conservative, and his newest book, Rome 476. And David is joining us from San Francisco. Hey, David, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank you, Tom.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Before we started recording, we were talking about a subject that I find really fascinating. And it really boils down to one word: consensus. Why is consensus important, and how does that really capture something very important with our government?
Consensus means everybody's of the same opinion. And you would look at Congress and think that the nation is completely divided. They fight like cats and dogs, like little children, when in fact the nation is really moderate, historically moderate. The voting districts are so gerrymandered that Democrats only run against Democrats, Republicans only run against Republicans, and who wins? The Democrat who's the most liberal and the Republican who's the most conservative. So in Congress, they're fighting each other as if they have nothing in common, when in fact the nation is moderate. And I think an important historic moment was the election of Donald Trump in 2016, because there was an element of catastrophe, but an element of consensus. The polls showed Hillary great majority. Some polls showed 90%. Donald Trump himself thought he wasn't going to win. He wasn't even in the country. He was negotiating hotels with Putin in Russia. He didn't think he was going to win. He just was having fun running. People lied on the polls, and they lied to their friends, and they all held their nose, and they voted for Donald Trump because there was a consensus that neither political party has any intention of solving the problems this nation, all people in this nation care about: the high cost of health care, poorly performing public schools, and lax law enforcement in the cities and at the border. Everyone cares about that, and the Congress has no intention of solving that problem.
Well said. Well said. I remember that election night. It came as quite a shock. Again, my newspaper of choice is the New York Times, and they certainly had Hillary ahead by a wide margin. And when the results came in by the end of the night, it was quite a shock. So it's interesting. So, and I understand that kind of defeats how we want democracy to work in our nation. But you also outlined how it really defeats the functioning of government, really achieving what our citizens want to be achieved. How do we recover from that? I mean, how can we undo this?
What you're saying is the problem with anything in life: short-term freedom, free markets, free voting, free social, doesn't always work in the short term, but in the long run, they seem self-correct. Everyone gets the message after a while. We're going through a social period of what's called wokeism, and students are telling professors exactly what they can say, and what words they should be using, what pronouns they should be using, and if not, they'll throw a pie in their face. And David Brooks, columnist for the New York Times, said that the nation's universities have been reduced to 1.5% conservative professorships. They clean them out. But that's now. That's not necessarily the future. And the consensus of 2016, that's an important to me historic moment, though it doesn't look like it, is that the nation is going to do something about the fact that they're not solving their problems, that their Congress is a mess. And I think the Democratic Party, within 30 years, is finished. It'll be a minority party. It's not going to go away. It's going to always be a conscience to the nation. Let's not forget about the less fortunate. It'll serve that purpose. But the Congress will be totally, Senate, House of Representatives will be Republican, Supreme Court will be Republican, or I should say conservative. Hopefully Republican won't be what Republican is today. It'll be a better, more classical conservative, and there'll be that's the beginning of a change. And that change is going to represent what's called classical liberalism or classical conservatism. The notion that the founding fathers got it right. They had a convention for, I think, 4 months, a collection of geniuses for 4 months sat down. That's never happened in the history of the world. A collection of geniuses sat down and wrote a one-page document, the Constitution. In Europe, they have a 254-page document, the Maastricht Agreement. Nobody knows what it says or what it means. But our Constitution, it's on one piece of paper, it's on an art easel in Washington, D.C. You can go look at it, you can go read it. It's a big paper because it's florid handwriting for the time. They're very simple rules. And the founding fathers just debated for 4 months what was best about 5th century Athens, 1st century Rome, and 18th century Age of Enlightenment, their time period. And they just pulled the best thought and the best examples from history and says, just do this and government is not going to fail. And we have a government that didn't fail. It stood the test of time and it will still. It's general. It accounts for anything that can happen in the future. It can account for gay rights. It can account for abortion. The founding fathers themselves says, we don't know what's going to happen. We're writing a very general document here that you just can't go wrong with. The nation has to agree to that, and then we'll reverse most of the legislation since 1933, the New Deal and the war on poverty, a great society. And the middle class, which pays all taxes, will have their income tax cut in half, and people will be forced to be more responsible, which is what the founding fathers had in mind. Freedom is not free. You have to be responsible, or it doesn't work. It doesn't work by solving people's problem by giving them money every time something goes wrong, which is what we do now.
Absolutely. It's an amazing perspective. It's an amazing achievement to create that one-page document, and I appreciate what you're pointing out as far as how those 3 epochs of history informed the creation of that great document. I just want to pause for 1 second and let our viewers and listeners know that this is an episode of a San Francisco Conservative podcast series featuring yours truly, Tom Martin, journalist asking questions, and author David Parker, author of A San Francisco Conservative, Income and Wealth, and his newest book, Rome 476, providing lots of thought-provoking answers. That last answer was quite remarkable. I think you condensed all of your work into that one.
Maybe I did.
That was amazing. I mean, but
on the cover of my 476 is the Roman Colosseum. The way we see it in ruins. And what happened in 476 is that the Roman soldiers didn't lift a finger when the Huns and the Vandals and the Visigoths, all our Halloween characters came in. They didn't lift a finger because they hadn't been paid. And they hadn't been paid because all tax revenue, and there was a lot of tax revenue. Rome was a powerful empire and the soldiers were the best in the world. All tax revenue went to pay interest on the debt. Nothing left for services. That's how close we are. That's why I put that Roman Colosseum up there.
Yeah, that couldn't possibly happen today, could it?
No, couldn't possibly happen. Yeah.
No. So it was interesting. As you know, I guess my kind of go-to media source these days is CNN, and at the time, again, at the time they were recording this, they had quite a historic event in Congress yesterday where 8 members of the House of Representatives managed to tilt the scales and oust their own guy, Kevin McCarthy, who was a Trump supporter and so on. And so this, like you were saying earlier about these extremists, and they don't represent mainstream opinion as far as I gather. And so some of the anchors on CNN were referring to this hasn't happened, going all the way back in history, 1776. I said, if that's as far back as you're going to go, you need to meet my friend David Parker. He can tell you a thing or two. But what can we learn from history? I mean, why is it so? Just to speak generally, why is it so important for us and for our elected representatives to study history, as you present so beautifully in all 3 of your books?
So we don't panic when we see the house falling apart. Oh, that's happened before. Before the Civil War, they were literally hitting each other with their fists in Congress. Because slavery was a great idea. How can you want to undo that? I mean, absurd as what we see today. And throughout history, there's been absurd fights and absurd wars. You could call the war in Ukraine kind of absurd, as if we didn't learn anything from World War II. And the UN doesn't exist. The UN doesn't stop wars. It encourages them. That's not true. But they don't stop wars. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing things that there's nothing new. And so we shouldn't panic. And that consensus was rough in 2016, and it's being played out right now, again, rough, very crude. But when a change is about to happen, that's kind of how it is. I don't know if listeners know the author Gertrude Stein. Woody Allen made a film about her.
Sure, Ernest Hemingway's friend and Picasso and all that.
Yeah, and so she was friends with Picasso, and she made a great statement. She says Picasso discovered and Brock the Cubism. Mm-hmm. But the first person who discovers it, that's a difficult thing. And their first works are going to be very rough. And the following artists, years later, centuries later, will have worked out all the problems that Picasso didn't work out when he figured it out. So that's what's happening here a little bit. This is
it's funny.
In for a change, but the process is rough and crude.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you mentioned that.
That's the historic perspective I want to put there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that's so important and so needed for so many of us these days, because so few people seem to read and study history. And it's funny when you mentioned that, it reminded me way back in college when I majored in philosophy at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and began to kind of specialize in something called paradigm shifts, how medicine changed over the years and so on. And so one of the great examples of paradigm shifts is astronomy. And I think if I remember correctly, they burned Galileo at the stake like a witch or somebody like that. Like, here's the way the universe really works. Like, that's unheard of. But anyone bringing something new into thinking it's going to be quite a shock, I guess. Right?
Well, there's always some vested interest that doesn't want that change and will do everything in its power to stop. They didn't burn Galileo. They put him in a closet for a while, for the rest of his life. But they didn't burn him.
Okay. But but you're still an optimist, right? We're not headed to a dead end. I mean, you mentioned you do see the demise of the Democratic Party, but overall, you see that democracy will go on.
Yeah, so I'm optimistic the Democratic Party will be put in its place. Progressivism will be put in its place as being wrong. And compassion is not wrong, but progressivism is wrong. The main difference between the two parties, progressives say, look at these problems. Let's spend some money. We're a rich nation. Let's not be so conservative. Be liberal. Spend some money. And conservative says, yes, those are problems. We can solve those problems better by getting government out of the picture and stop trying to solve problems by spending money. I'm a musician. I'm a jazz musician. I have a big band in San Francisco. One of my trumpet players is a cat from Brooklyn, and he was in a Brooklyn barbershop. It was the brothers, as it were. And someone was talking about government's got to do this. Government should be doing this. We got all these poor people. And one person in that barbershop stood up and said, if you can solve problems by throwing money, you don't have a problem.
Yeah,
Meaning you can't solve problems with money. We want a rich nation like us doesn't know what to do with its cash.
Well, I know you've written a series of essays. Again, in addition to your great books, you've written a series of essays for the Epoch Times, the San Francisco edition, and also the national edition on education. So, give us to kind of wrap up this conversation. That really provides evidence that money alone doesn't solve the problem.
Well, you can say the war on poverty, 1964, not only did not solve poverty was 15% in 1964. The needle never budged on average, up and down, but on average it's 15% today, more or less. And they spent 23 trillion, 3 or 4 times all the wars America has ever fought, and zero result. And some of that money went to education. Maybe a lot of money went to education. They doubled what from 1970 to 2000 what they spent per student. And I think from 2000 to 20 years now, they've probably doubled it again. And every time they spend more money, the test scores go down, down, down. In an inverse relation, not perfect inverse, but inverse relation is so clear. Look at the graph, it's a V. Money up, test scores down. And for the last 50 years at least, the U.S. Department of Education states, it's on their website, that 36% of the nation is proficient in reading and math. Students, and that's a euphemism for D+, proficient.
That's terrible.
We're ignorant. The Navy recently dropped its reading level for entrance. It can't get naval cadets to 4th grade reading level, the level at which American high school students graduate. That's what money did to education.
It's terrible, terrible. Well, so tell it.
According to David Parker.
Yes, sir. Well, in closing, again, I just want to remind everyone to please visit David's website, davidsparkeressays.com, where you can pick up copies of his 3 books, Income and Wealth, The San Francisco Conservative, and Rome 476. And you can certainly purchase copies also on Amazon.com. David, any closing words?
Well, my closing words are pretty much what I said today, that this nation has to go back. And if you're not sure about it, read a little history. Read the Constitution and read the Federalist Papers, the arguments for it. They are great. They're a masterpiece in their own right. And read Democracy in America, 1835. That's after the Revolution. And de Tocqueville says, America, get rid of slavery. You're out of your mind, because you are about to become the greatest nation on earth. Your citizens are so responsible compared to citizens in Europe or anywhere else. They're sitting in the backwoods of Kentucky with newspapers, talking world affairs. In Europe, nobody is reading the newspaper. No peasant is reading the newspaper, or farm workers are reading the newspaper. You are about to become an amazing nation. But you are the most responsible citizens. He said it. That's part of the key for the future. Citizens, you're on your own. You buy your own health care, you buy your own, put your money in your own pension. Government is out of the picture. The cost of health insurance was the cost of auto insurance before Medicare. It'll go back to that. That's the end of the problem right there.
So many important points. Well, I know that anyone who's joining us, listening and or viewing, is concerned about our democracy. And Mr. Parker is telling us it's not too late to prepare yourself to keep that spirit alive. Buy his books, read his books. I think they are all masterpieces, speaking masterpieces. So thanks, David.
Okay,
Great to see you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.